Hello, I'm Brian Fox. Welcome to my channel, I Hate Rock Music. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the band Fear Itself. And really interesting band. Of course, the main focus of the band was Ellen McElwain on vocals, guitar, harmonica, and organ. And after the demise of the band, she moved to Canada and carved out quite a solo career. And all of her records as a solo artist are really recommended. Her vocals are really amazing, as well as her guitar work and a really singular presence. But she was in this rock band, Fear Itself. They started in Atlanta, Georgia, and then they ended up moving to New York City and being part of the Greenwich Village scene, which is really hard for you to imagine when I listen to their music. And so the entire band was Ellen McElwain on vocals, guitar, harmonica, and organ, Chris Zaloom on guitar, Bill McCord on drums, and Steve Cook on bass. And they recorded one album released in 1968 on Dot Records. Dot Records had a really interesting roster of rock bands at the time. Of course, previous to that, they were known for a lot of country artists and middle of the road type of music. But Dot Records had Fraternity of Man, Mount Rushmore, Colors, Hamilton Streetcar, The Illusion, Mint Tattoo, and Yankee Dollar. And I think a couple of the notable bands on Dot Records, Mint Tattoo from San Francisco, was a really interesting record. And then Fraternity of Man, of course, had their first album on ABC and then got picked up by Dot. And then the two Mount Rushmore albums, a band out of San Francisco that was pretty heavy, but unfortunately were not quite great. Definitely captures the era. But the Fear Itself record is probably one of the best things that showed up on Dot Records, produced by Tom Wilson, who had worked with the Velvet Underground and Frank Zappa and the Mothers in the early days. And the Fear Itself album is pretty striking for 1968. Um, a fair amount of heaviness, and Chris Zaloom is a pretty striking guitar player. And as I've noted about a couple other records, for something to come out in 1968 that had the heaviness of a bunch of the tracks on Fear Itself is really striking. And Chris Zaloom is a pretty stellar guitar player, once again, particularly for 1968. And the band replaced the bass player Steve Cook after the album was recorded, and they added a bass player named Paul Album, and he died in a car wreck, and that was the end of the band, and that's when Ellen McElwain moved to Canada. But the record itself is great, really unusual. Basically a blues band. They did three blues standards on the record: "Born Under a Bad Sign," "In My Time of Dying," and the album opens with "Crawling Kingsnake." And not only is it striking because of Ellen McElwain's very distinctive vocals, but the band is just really solid. And as I mentioned, Chris Zaloom is quite a guitar player. And so their blues classics are not only fairly straightforward as blues classics, but they have a heaviness to them that the band added, which to me is really striking for blues bands, particularly 1968, to kind of um, reinterpret blues standards less traditionally and a little more heavy. Really makes Fear Itself stand out quite a bit. And there's one little novelty tune on there, which kind of breaks up the pace of the album. But there's a couple of originals on there that, once again, are pretty unusual song structures, and pretty heavy. And I don't mean heavy in the sense of, proto metal or anything like that, but just you can tell they're a really loud, powerful, crunching band. And as I mentioned, the guitar work is really upfront and really stellar, and just heavy. I don't know how else to describe it. So as far as albums from 1968, it's a real stunner, and I imagine that live they must have been pretty incredible. And I can see why, starting out in Atlanta, Georgia, uh, I'm not sure how the audience would react there, and it's even hard to imagine them placed in the middle of the New York Greenwich Village scene as well, with this kind of heavy blues thing. A lot different than a lot of bands that were coming out of the East Coast, and particularly New York City. So I'll post a link below. Check it out. I highly recommend it. Once again, pretty striking album for 1968. Um, the production on it's a little muddy, but in 1968, of course, a lot of recording studios were still having trouble recording really loud bands, and in this case, it kind of shows. But that said, the somewhat lo-fi aspect of the record kind of adds to its heaviness in a lot of ways. But again, really strong arrangements of these traditional blues tunes, and then their originals are very quirky and interesting. And then you put Alan McElwain's vocals on top of it, and a really unique, striking band, and I think quite great. And as I often say about so many of the bands that I talk about, it would have been really stunning to hear this band continue. Um, for 1968, it's pretty striking, but what they would have turned into if they lasted through 1969 and 1970, with all that potential and what they achieved on the 1968 album, they would be a lot more notorious than they are now. But sadly, that didn't happen. So anyway, Fear Itself, credible band, great record, well worth checking out if you haven't heard it, and pretty monumental for 1968 especially.